The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started in a couple of minutes. We're just going to give a few more minutes to see if we can get a couple of more folks to join, and then we'll be starting shortly. Thank you. All right, everybody, we can go ahead and get started here. Well, first and foremost, I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, and also start off by thanking everyone for joining us today. This is our second webinar of 2017. We're very glad to have you. Just looking at the registration, it's a pretty high turnout, so really glad that on both accounts, one, that we're striking a chord that resonates with folks, and that two, people are really interested in this topic, so we're glad to be hosting today. So for today's topic, we're going to be focusing on enhancing coordinated entry with employment, specifically highlighting three communities and what they've been doing in innovative ways around connecting employment and housing together. In having a look at the registrants for today's webinar, it looks like a lot of us are coming from housing backgrounds, myself included. And I think the common goal that we all share is that we're really looking to help folks connect to stability in housing, stability in sort of all sorts of other life facets. Specifically with housing, long-term stability is really tied to two specific things. Either we're connecting folks to income that they can support that housing, whether it be benefits or other sort of income strategies that way, or it's connecting folks to employment where they can actually support the housing that they have. Those are sort of the two ways that we can really support long-term housing for folks in a lot of situations. Now we know, before we dig into this topic, that a lot of communities have different funding structures and different program strategies, and that employment may not be the first thing that folks can quite jump to. But one of the things that we thought about doing with this webinar is really thinking about how can we use existing strategies to build that employment up for folks that may not have the time or the bandwidth to do so. One of that strategies is to use our existing coordinated entry system, which a lot of communities currently have. So today we're going to really talk about 3 cities and what they've done to build up their coordinated entry system. Before we jump into that content, before I introduce our speakers and myself as well, I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping for us, for folks who may be new to the GoToWebinar software. So as you can see, for most of you on your screens, you should have a navigation panel to the far right of the screen. This is where you're going to do most of, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to raise your hand, those are all the sorts of things you can do with this software. So first and foremost, for questions, if you want to ask a question, we welcome questions throughout today's presentation. Feel free to send them in throughout if you came with questions or if you find some along the way via the chat or question box to the right. You can see that there. If you just open that box up, you can type in your question and we can log those and save them for the Q&A towards the end. As I mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end of today's webinar, so make sure to send those questions in. For those who are wondering, the recording of today's presentation, along with the slides as well, will be made available on our website as soon as we can. So look for those shortly to be posted there. Finally, for those who are on Twitter and want to tweet along with us, you can use the hashtag #CoordinateForJobs. We know it's very, very clever. But we welcome you to do that and to join us in the Twitter space and sort of share things you're learning or things you're excited about and really get the conversation built up online. So any other questions or comments, or if you have any tech issues or things along the way, let us know via that chat box. And I'll go ahead and introduce myself and the rest of our panelists on the next slide here. So first and foremost, I will introduce myself. My name is Carl Wiley. I'm the coordinator for the National Center on Employment and Homelessness, which is a program of Heartland Alliance here in Chicago. My main role is to focus on new and better ways to connect the fields of housing and employment together, which is why I'm particularly excited to have the folks that we have on the call today. One of the folks, I'm not sure if John was able to join us. It looks like, I think he has been able to join. So John Rio is the Senior Program Associate for Advocates for Human Potential, which is located in Houston, Texas. John is a consultant, a speaker, a trainer who provides expertise on housing, employment, and supportive services for homeless populations, including veterans and individuals with behavioral conditions. John is currently a Senior Program Associate at Advocates for Human Potential and is the former co-director for the Chronic Homelessness Employment Technical Assistance Center, or CHEETA, which was supported by the U.S. Department of Labor. So currently, John provides HUD, the VA, and SAMHSA with supported technical assistance and has led AHP's contract around working for Department of Labor's Homeless Veteran Reintegration Program. John has also done consultation with Department of Labor around Women's Bureau project on promising practices for homeless women who are also veterans. I will just say John's been doing, thinking and working in this space for quite a long time, so we're really excited to have John on to offer his thoughts and expertise in this area. So welcome, John. Also, today we are joined. Oh, great. And I'm glad. It sounds like the audio is working too. We didn't get a chance to test, but it sounds like everything's clear.
Excellent.
Great. Next up, we have Heather Muller. Heather's the Senior Program Manager for CSH Houston. Heather is experienced in and driven towards systems innovation and change implementation and logistics. She has 17 years of direct service and program management under her belt in the social service world. Currently, she is a Senior Program Manager at CSH Houston's office. Heather is responsible for project managing the implementation of Houston's Coordinated Access System, as well as the implementation of Houston's Income Now system, and implementation of several other new supportive housing programs in the Houston community. Prior to joining CSH, Heather was a program manager at Search Homeless Services in Houston, Texas, which is a COC-funded nonprofit agency, where she operated and managed employment and engagement service programs serving homeless individuals. She also worked for 2 years at Transitional Mental Health Association in San Luis Obispo, California, where she started and managed a permanent supportive housing program. She also holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of San Francisco. Heather is, in addition to all of those amazing things, is also our program lead for our Connections Project work in Houston, and is doing a tremendous amount of work in thinking about really practical ways to blend housing and employment together. So we're super excited to have Heather on as well. We also have Nancy Phillips, who's a fellow Heartland person here with us in Chicago. Nancy is the Senior Director of Pathways to Success Initiatives at Heartland Alliance, where she oversees workforce, asset building, refugee, and immigrant community services, as well as other services for residents in our public housing. Nancy has worked in employment services for persons experiencing homelessness for over 15 years and was the founding director of the award-winning program Women Craft, which employed women transitioning from homelessness as artisans creating handmade recycled paper sold across the U.S. for things like wedding invitations for more than 13 years. She's also the co-chair of the Chicago Continuum of Care's Employment Task Force and has served in that role for since 2013. We're really excited to have Nancy on board. She's had a wealth of experience in direct service as well as sort of program and macro level work, and I think brings a really great voice to this conversation we're going to have today. So welcome, Nancy. Finally, we also have Danielle Winslow, who is the program manager for All Home, which is in King County. So All Home, as I mentioned, is the COC and organizing body responsible for strategic planning to end homelessness in King County, which also includes the city of Seattle, Washington. Under the All Home strategic plan to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time, Danielle leads homeless strategies around diversion, rapid rehousing, and employment with special attention to families and people of color. So that is our panelists for today. As I mentioned, these are all folks that are deep in the work or are also directly working with us on the Connections Project. We're really excited to have them. A really brief introduction as I move into just a quick intro of national initiatives, and then we'll jump into our content and let our presenters speak for a brief period of time. So first and foremost, just a bit about national initiatives, just to set the stage of why we're thinking about this and sort of how we enter the space of employment and homeless work here. First and foremost, National Initiatives believes we're dedicated to ending chronic unemployment and poverty in all the ways that folks may experience them. We believe that every person deserves the right and the opportunity to support themselves and to support their families through work, and that we should really help communities in every way we can to support that end goal. We try and situate ourselves at the intersection of research, practice, and policy as a way to really give ourselves a good vantage point on what's working across the country. On the research end, right, we're all supposed to be evidence-based. It's a really great practice to hold to. So what's happening academically? What does the research show are really effective strategies for connecting folks to employment opportunities? So we like to really learn as much as we can and share those studies as far wide as possible. Secondly, at the practice end, right, research is only really half the picture. We have to know what's really working in communities that may not be rigorously tested, but nonetheless, people are definitely getting jobs. So we like to keep a good ear to the ground and find out what's working and share those practices across the country with folks, this being one of them, right, a webinar based on 3 cities doing something very innovative. But finally, the policy side, right, neither the research nor the practice can really take root and help the folks we wanted to help if there's not policies in place that are really thinking with the person in the center. So we try and have a good presence in Washington, D.C. to really move those policies and help move the needle for folks to get connected to quality employment. So that's us. That is our work. One of the things that I will do now is I'll touch a little bit on this Connections Project, which is where 3 of these sites come from. This was our foray into the space of trying to directly find and fund specific ideas around ending homelessness via employment. So what we were able to do with the gracious help of the Melville Charitable Trust and the Oak Family Foundation, we were able to gather funding and resources necessary to build off of our existing work and to just source these ideas. So we held an RFP. We got lots of great submissions. Hopefully some of those folks are on the line today. We got really great submissions. Ultimately, we had to select 5. We have these 5 great communities, 3 of which are represented on the phone call today, all of which are moving the needle and really pushing forward unique strategies to connect people in housing services to employment. We don't have time to obviously talk about all of these, but if you're interested, I'd like to direct you back to our website. We have plenty more information, and we'll be coming up with many more publications on the work and the amazing things that these folks are doing. So that's where we sort of got into this. These are some of the communities that we've either offered direct funding and technical assistance on their pathways towards these sort of new ideas, one of which being blending coordinated entry and employment together. So that's enough of me talking. What I really want to do is move over to letting some of our panelists talk a bit. So first and foremost, we have John Rio up. As I mentioned, he's Senior Program Associate for Advocates for Human Potential. One of the things that John's going to do is give us sort of a big picture, an overview of what coordinated entry is, identifying, how do we sort of find and elicit people's employment needs, and also how do we start to interface with the mainstream workforce system. So if we've got John on the line, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Carl, very much for the introduction and the kind words about all of us. It's a pleasure to be on today's webinar with all of you in communities across the country. I think we all share in the struggle to try to affect systems that are responsive and provide the connections for homeless people to end their homelessness and to have the kind of fruitful life that they desire in the community. So I'm just going to give a brief overview, and I should also acknowledge that I come from a position where I think employment is a central component to the income needs of the populations that we serve in homeless assistance programs. For me, it's always been about housing, having an adequate supply of safe, secure, and affordable housing, and the means by which to retain that housing. And for me, retaining housing has something to do with a purposeful day activity and the right amount of income to be as close to self-sufficient as possible. Next slide, please. You all have been paying attention and challenged by this new shift in thinking. I'll bet it's not so new. In the pre-Hearth days or the old system, we would often ask, does this client fit into our program? And the system was about a variety of programs, each looking as the client appeared before them, looking at that client from the unique lens of that program. With Hearth and with our paradigm shift comes the shift in thinking from what does this client, how does this client fit into my program, to what housing and service interventions are best suited for this client. So this is a significant change in direction, and many of you are, I imagine, struggling with how to do it for housing. That is to ask what kind of housing makes sense for this person, and how do I connect this person with the housing of their choice and of their need. We are also expected under coordinated entry to not only address housing, but we're also to address services. Before it was the client that would wander around to different programs to find out if they were eligible for that program, and each agency had their own ways of determining eligibility and readiness for their program. They had their own tools and ways of conducting assessments and what they considered to be important or predictive of success. In essence, agencies had their own processes for determining whether or not a client would get into their program. Next slide, please. In coordinated entry or centralized intake, however you want to call it, we've changed that process, as you know, where you're trying to orchestrate a way for people to get to, or individuals or families, to get to the service of need, to make sure that they get to the right place. And that involves looking at the access, how are they going to easily get housing and services. In a coordinated assessment or coordinated entry, there is an assessment process that uses standardized tools. It's not the 10, 20, or 30 different tools that individual agency use, but a centralized tool that looks through a common lens around the needs of people who are falling into the homeless system. It's also about assignment through a coordinated entry portal, if you will. People are connected with the components of the system that they may need in order to leave their homelessness behind. So assignment is part of that, and obviously in coordinated entry, we are probably more accountable than we have been before, that people are matched to meet their needs, and that the agencies, the service agencies, the recipients of referred clients are accountable for the delivery of services to that client. So the key features of the coordinated entry system are the smaller number of entry points, use of a common assessment, and standardized coordinated efforts between and among the local service providers. So theoretically and in reality, I think this does mean that there are benefits to the individuals who fall into homelessness. That is, they know the access points. There are fewer access points and they should get whatever they need through those points. That their experience shares some commonality, that they are assuredly being evaluated to determine what their needs are, and that somewhat reliably we'd be able to identify those needs and get people to their services that they require. It also suggests that there is some centralized way of knowing about the availability of housing across the system, as well as the capacity for services. So it allows the continuum of care in the service system, hopefully in partnership with the workforce investment system, to be able to know what the employment capacity is of the system and where its strengths and weaknesses are, and to have an action plan from a planning point of view about how to expand or modify services to be more responsive, that's tailored to the needs of homeless individuals appearing for employment services. Next slide. So we could, well, first off, I guess I'd have to acknowledge that for the years that I've been doing this, it has been some time since we have national data about employment and homelessness. It certainly is lacking. The last national study goes back to Dr. Martha Burt's work in 1999, reporting on the national the picture of our homeless population and the service providers that serve them as to what their needs are around employment. Since then, we've have a variety of research activities and pieces of information, including anecdotal information and needs surveys, that we know that employment is an essential component, one that is often preferred by homeless individuals, that in so much as they would like to have earned income. So in an employment pathway, we're really looking at initially triaging the individual coming into the system. So we're trying to determine whether they are needing earned income or unearned income, trying to get a sense of how well they are prepared for getting the income that they might need, and having some kind of a plan, an employment plan, as they come into early on in the system. So coordinated entry clearly moves up some of these determinations, moves them upstream, and that is also an important feature of our work. Next slide. Identifying income needs, I'm sure you all recognize, whether you're talking about permanent supportive housing or a rapid rehousing program, that income is a central component, and that we obviously don't have enough subsidies to go around for every individual and family that needs that kind of assistance. We're just not having an adequate supply, although we might have that as our goal. It is an ambitious one that I think is moderated somewhat by our strategies to help homeless individuals access a variety of income, whether that's Social Security income or food stamp or other cash income that they might be eligible for, or sources of earned income. So we're triaging early on to determine what the needs are of an individual coming into the system. And the question is whether or not that income is sufficient to meet their housing needs. and their personal needs. Is there a mismatch between their ability to have income and ability to navigate their way out of homelessness? And we have individuals coming into the system who are wanting employment or a better job, others that may seem reluctant or feeling that they are not quite ready yet for employment, but might have an interest in it. Or they might be receiving some benefits, but not all the benefits that they're entitled to. So the first step in coordinated entry is some kind of triaging around income and employment. Next slide. It might be useful to look at this matrix as you plan and think about your employment service needs for job seekers that experience homelessness. This is a matrix based on two axes. One is support needs on the left-hand side, going from a low-intensity support needs to high-intensity support needs. And then on the bottom of the page, from modest challenges to significant challenges. So if we were to look at our population from a planning point of view, the number of individuals that have high intensity support needs with significant challenges, so that might be in our group labeled C on this matrix. The kind of intervention from what we know that what works might be candidates for supported employment interventions, probably linked with PSH or an intensive housing program. And the opposite of that is our category A, our group of individuals who don't have a lot of support needs and whose challenges are modest. They might do well to have a tighter relationship with our workforce investment system, particularly the American Job Centers. Those are your local career centers in every community across the country. There are some 2,500 workforce investment boards, American Job Centers that are governed by about 600 workforce boards across the country. So in this matrix, it's trying to look at ways that a continuum of care can group individuals to look at their service needs and predict where their system needs to grow or strengthen. Next slide, please. Employment development plans are important where an individual has expressed the desire to go to work. The extent to which a coordinated entry program addresses employment planning will vary somewhat. There are some systems that are delving into an assessment, an employment assessment at the point of coordinated entry. There are others that are doing the triage function, and once an employment need is identified, individuals are referred to or linked to employment service providers who conduct the more in-depth assessment and the development plan. Still others are using something like a standardized employment readiness assessment, such as the ERS or a scale that I developed called the Employment Readiness Determination Profile. So those are assessments that need to be done. It's when and where that local systems need to identify that becomes important. Next slide. Workforce agencies, I hope there are some workforce agencies on the call. If you are, welcome, and I'm glad you're with us. Your role in this is a critical partner with the continuums of care to participate with them in their coordinated entry system. You are a receiver of referrals and help design the system of services. For those of you who don't know, American Job Centers is if you will, the new title referring to community-based services that are under the jurisdiction of a workforce investment board. They are WIOA funded, and they operate under direct or contracted arrangements with the Workforce Board. These are your partners and your first order of partners in the workforce system locally, along with a variety of non-for-profit community service providers who specialize in employment assistance. I encourage you, if you're a COC or if you are a housing provider, to link with your job centers. And if you're a job center, please link with your continuum of care and get information around their coordinated entry processes and where they're at. Carl, I think I am going to turn this over to Heather, our colleague in Houston, for conversation about their approach.
Yep, that's great. We'll have you on, Heather.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Heather Muller, and I am, like Carl said, with CSH, and I am attached to our community's lead agency. And I am an additional project manager with the Houston team, and one of the projects that I've been working on is called Income Now. Next slide. So Income Now is our system for folks that are experiencing homelessness that are going to get access to housing. They also connect with Income Now. And Income Now is fully integrated into our coordinated access system. From the slide there, you can see the basic map with which we operate from. A set of points of access into our system. Those are all coordinated points of access into our system for accessing housing and income. We decided early on that we were not going to continue to have a conversation anymore about access to housing without including access to income. So these two conversations happen right from the get-go, as you can see there in the diagram. We start with a housing and income assessment at those access points. That assessment leads to housing and income matching to different housing and income programs. And from there, after the match has happened, that leads into a referral. And lastly, there is a step called navigation, where we are connecting folks from referral to an actual lease up or to a job placement or a SOAR application maybe. But we found that we were losing lots of folks from referral to actually connecting to that housing or that income opportunity. And so we added in this service called navigation. Next slide. So the slide that was up previously, that's at the in front of the curtain, so to speak, and the experience that participants use, or the experience participants have in using our system. This slide here depicts the behind the curtain. So what's actually happening within coordinated entry. All those steps that were on the previous slide happen within HMIS, our Homeless Management Information System. So it's an electronic process. The assessment is in HMIS. All of the inventory for housing and for income options are all in HMIS. The logic is built in, and the referral also happens electronically through HMIS, the Houston system. So what's happening back there behind the curtain is that folks come in, they do that assessment, and they are at the first layer of matching that happens is to a housing intervention. And in Houston's system at this time, that means they're either connected to a permanent supportive housing option or to a rapid rehousing option. The second layer of matching that happens is then to an income intervention. We have 3 income interventions that we have built in or are building into our system right now. One would be SOAR and Ticket to Work. That's for individuals experiencing homelessness. It's an expedited process for accessing disability income. The second intervention would be supported employment, which John made reference to earlier. It's an employment service, income service that is a little more high touch. And the third income intervention that we connect folks to would be our public workforce system. And for us in Houston, that's called Workforce Solutions. Whatever your American Job Center is called in your community, that would be the equivalent. So I've lined them up. You see there that if someone is connected to permanent supportive housing, they're also connected to SOAR, supported employment, and those connected to rapid rehousing would match for public workforce system. That's not exactly how it goes. It's more nuanced than that. Some people in permanent supportive housing may be connected to the public workforce system and rapid rehousing to the other interventions. But generally, for you to understand that there's logic that's happening behind the curtain, and people are matched. But generally, these are kind of the buckets that people fall into. Next slide. So a little bit of context for how we've gotten to this place. We started this, and I should add in, this is a team of people that are working on this. Most specifically, Gary Greer from the Coalition for the Homeless. That's our lead agency. He and I are project managing this. In the next several slides here, an update of how far we've come on the design that I have already articulated in the previous couple of slides. We started in, we started May-ish of 2016, so we're nearing a year, and here's the progress that we've made so far. So within our electronic system, the housing options are, the side doors are closed on all permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. Folks only access either of those housing interventions through coordinated access. And likewise, on the income side, our system now matches for workforce solutions or public workforce system referrals, and it is matching for our supported employment intervention and our SOAR intervention. The next phase of implementation after matching is then that referral. And at this point, we are referring to the public workforce system or workforce solutions. We send those directly. And we are matching to our SOAR providers. So the side doors are closed on both workforce solutions referrals and SOAR referrals. What you see there under supported employment, we are not sending any referrals at this time. We do not have that part of the system built out yet. So in, what is that? It's about 11 months, we've closed the side doors on 2 of our 3 interventions. Next slide. What that looks like from a geographic standpoint is, this is roughly central Houston, what it looks like. And we have a number of locations that we're providing services to. The way home is what we refer to as our homeless response system. So any of the blue stars would be locations where homeless services were already being provided, and we've just integrated access to Income Now services, whether that be SOAR or the public workforce system, into those blue locations. So to be more specific, some of those stars are shelters and day shelters, and we have staff from the public workforce system, from Workforce Solutions, that staff up those shelter and day shelter locations, so that when someone gets an assessment from coordinated access, they're referred to housing, but they are also referred to income providers right there at the locations where they're already at, because moving on income happens when you operationalize this. Moving on income is faster than moving on housing, so it made sense to go ahead and put staff right there in the shelters and day shelters, and let's get that process moving as quickly as possible. The orange stars are our 3 of our public workforce system offices. We have 22 in our area, and those 3 are kind of highly utilized locations. People experiencing homelessness primarily use those 3 locations. And so we have staff from the Way Home, or our homeless response system, that are co-located at those locations as well. But we are able to send referrals and make connections for folks in all of the public workforce offices within our community. Next slide. Okay, so you don't need to be able to see all this and understand what each little box means and what the decision tree is that's happening here. But I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what's actually happening behind the curtain and how sort of complicated the decision-making process is and the matches. And I say this to say, I point this piece out because in all of the process of making these changes over the last 11 months, the team and myself have really come to realize what the reality was pre-coordinated entry. And pre-coordinated entry this one little diagram here that's probably difficult to understand was the responsibility of those that were using our system to figure out. Instead, we've now taken on the responsibility and put this into our system and put it back on our shoulders for us to figure out what direction people should go and which service people should end up getting access to. So it's just really important that two things come out of this little picture here for me. Is one, once you go to start integrating, it is very, very complicated. It's really complex. Each one of those boxes represents a handful of partners, a handful of locations. It gets very cumbersome and difficult to figure out inventory and eligibility criteria and all the different aspects of getting somebody from point A to point B. But we can continue to make that the problem of those using our system, keep making our system difficult to understand and hard to figure out how to connect from one place to the next, or we can take on that responsibility. And so today in Houston, we bear the burden of the complexity of our system instead of allowing those that are using our system to have to deal with that, like we did for decades at this point. Next slide. A little bit of perspective, just for, again, some more context. Houston's big, and so it's important to know, to kind of figure out how would you scale this in different communities. We don't need to go through the details of this slide here, but we'll frequently asked, how do you staff this? And it gives you a little bit of an idea of the number of staff. We were working with about 17 people over the last 11 months to integrate all of this, access to the public workforce system and connecting folks directly to public workforce system. These are the different roles that people had. EC means employment counselor, just as a side note. But I believe these slides will be posted, and so you can take a look at this slide at another time just for staffing context and to give you an idea of the sheer number of partners that we had to pull in to make this possible and to actually take it to scale across our community. Next slide. Similarly, a little bit of a staffing breakdown on SOAR capacity, building out SOAR capacity. We're looking at somewhere between a need of 6 and 10 dedicated SOAR providers in order to meet the need within our community and to match the flow that's coming through coordinated entry. So now that we have a coordinated entry system in Houston built to scale, we're able to really understand what the flow is, or the need in this case, and then match that to our resources much more strategically and be more effective in our utilization of the resources that we have. So as we watched people coming through coordinated entry, we were able to kind of put numbers on how long it takes to do a SOAR application relative to the number of people coming through and what our staffing ratios would be. And it looks like we need, like I said, 6 to 10 dedicated, that's all they do, 100% of their time is SOAR applications to meet the flow, to meet the need coming through coordinated entry in Houston. Right now, we've got locked in 2 at one agency, 2 at another agency, and 1 at our third agency. And we are trying to secure funding for 1 to 4 more over the next, we're shooting for over the next 6 months-ish to get those last few. Next slide. So I've articulated the design of Income Now as it is integrated into coordinated entry into Houston, and again, some more perspective on timing and what you can expect when you go all in on this kind of integration in the community. We build most things in Houston not with a pilot, but we build it with scale in mind, and we just work our way up. So this is the kind of progress that we have made so far. Again, remember we started closing the side doors on access to our public workforce system through coordinated entry in May of 2016, and we closed the side doors on SOAR October of 2016. So we're 11 months in on public workforce system, and we are 4 or 5-ish months in on SOAR. So what we've got so far in the public workforce system, through coordinated entry, we have enrolled 1,087 unduplicated people on our public workforce system. And to date, actually this is as of, I pulled the report on 3/7, so 13 days ago. We had 407 unduplicated permanent placements, 444 unduplicated total placements. We're most interested in permanent placements, but thought it right to tell you that there are a handful more of folks that have been placed in other positions. And we're averaging right now $10.03 is our average wage on those individuals permanently placed through our public workforce system. On SOAR, like I said, we closed the side doors on October 25th, and for anybody who has any experience in accessing or applying for disability income, you know the timeline there, a bit long. So we're sorting through that and trying to figure out the points with which we can actually influence that timeline. But to date, we have 47 folks enrolled, unduplicated people enrolled, but we do not have any outcomes yet as far as acceptances and denials on those applications. So we will keep you up to date from Houston. But that's progress that we've made here in the last month in terms of design, integrating income now into coordinated entry, and the outcomes that we've achieved so far. Thanks for the opportunity to share what's happening in one community in the country.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much, Heather. There's such good information in there. And I think really starts to spell out how we can really add these questions, really build this into coordinated entry system. So thank you. So next, and also just before we jump into Nancy's portion, if you have any questions for John or for Heather, feel free to send them in the chat and we'll keep logging them and get to that in the Q&A. So up next we have Nancy Phillips. Nancy is the Senior Director of Pathways to Success Initiative here at Heartland Alliance and also the co-chair of the Continuum of Care Task Force here in Chicago. She will talk a little bit about the designing and building of what they're doing here in Chicago around sort of the similar work, and also some of the challenges and successes they've had along the way. So I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Thanks, Carl. So a good thing about presenting in the middle is we're actually more in the beginning, earlier stages and planning stage for Chicago's work on coordinating employment assessment with coordinated access. So I think for people who are just starting out, we may have some more initial lessons learned to share out of that. Next slide, please. So Chicago Job Council is a policy and advocacy group in Chicago and is the lead Connections Project grantee and is part of our employment task force. So I'm subbing in for Carrie Thomas today, and here's her contact info if you have bigger questions. Thanks. Next slide. So as we said, I'm on the Chicago Continuum of Care Employment Task Force, which is the core of as an official committee of the Continuum of Care. But in addition to the 12 voting members in our charter structure, we have a whole host of other interested parties that have been working together for over 3 years to work on how can we better, as a whole continuum system, how can we better serve the interests of job seekers experiencing homelessness in Chicago. For a number of years, we had plateaued out at a small number of persons leaving services with income increase due to employment. So we were hovering in the 9 and 10% range. So our vision, as it says there, is to double our success rate with job seekers who are experiencing homelessness across the whole continuum. And so that's why for the past over 3 years, these stakeholders here have been meeting together to understand both sides of the system, workforce services, and then what are issues around homeless services, and then better align them. So we feature city, county, and private workforce funders. Chicago has a little bit of a decentralized workforce system, so there's more than, so I would call it actually workforce systems. We also have a number of committed funders, and we have Chicago Jobs Council and Corporation for Supportive Housing or other stakeholders besides the workforce agencies and homeless service agencies that are working on this project together. Thanks. Next slide. When we first started convening our employment task force, we envisioned more of a complete employment assessment to ask each person who was entering services through coordinated entry to ask many questions about employment and the things that would be needed to provide a real high-quality referral to a high-quality workforce program where people might experience success, instead of just a list of services that they would, work the phones or have, the same kind of like not great matching system that people had to experience before. We also envisioning, the single case manager for homeless service agency in which employment is just one of the dozen things they're going to talk about at that time with the individual. So we had this idea for a longer employment assessment initially and drafted one out. We also did some asset mapping around what are all the workforce services that are already connecting to this population, and we asked also homeless service agencies how they are executing referrals now to the system. And then we understood from the fact that both of us with one foot in each camp professionally, working with the population and with workforce and employment services, needed some information and tools to train frontline staff for both of the systems. So we've been partnering together on these three things and executing those, as our initial kind of place to start. Next, please. So as I mentioned, we drafted a longer employment assessment, and then we used that to conduct focus groups with Chicago's continuum of care constituency groups. We learned a lot from Houston and Seattle that you guys are going to also hear from today, and we participated in a focus group around diversion and what services would be the most effective for diverting people from homelessness at the outset. We presented to the Coordinated Access Steering Committee, and we presented our assessment with the work group that was working on the assessment tool for entry. So we incorporated all of that learning from the top 5 bullet points into changing our assessment from a series of questions for the participants to a kind of that same kind of workflow model that we saw from Houston, and we incorporated all of the continuum of care providers into questions, and then reduced the number of questions, which I think was a key learning opportunity for us and a key turning point. And then we identified where initial referrals might go. Next, please. So now our revised, slightly revised, if you saw this at the National Initiatives Amazing A Nation That Works conference in October, then this is a slightly updated and improved version, and it was improved by all of our integrating with other COC constituency groups. So we had to go around to a series of different meetings with other groups to talk about our vision for the employment assessment and to hear back from them. So now a person would come in and would be asked, would you like to explore a way to increase your income through work? And we wanted to be really overt with a lot of the reasons that that participants or staff members might be a little reluctant to connect people to employment is one, that people have had experiences that weren't that productive in seeking out different referrals, but two, that if people are on benefits or have achieved some type of housing stability in the system, that employment might be seen as a potential disruptor. So we wanted to kind of get overtly at that, and then just to understand that part of what we're going to need to do in this project is to make sure that both workforce and housing service systems recognize and are able to expertly give people guidance on how to best secure housing stability and meet their employment goals if they have employment goals. If people say yes, they are interested in employment services, we would be able to connect them to either City of Chicago Department of Family Support Services workforce grantee programs. Some of those are geared specifically for this population, but not all are. Or the one-stops workforce centers or American Job Centers that we've heard them referred to. So, so we had to, this was another learning part, is to understand that to ask the question, we must be able to give people a place to land, and that for staff members to want to do it, but also for participants to experience that there's a purpose for each question that they're engaging with during coordinated entry. Next, please. So where we are now is we've developed that plan for what would happen from a participant perspective, and we are working to get ready to pre-pilot that launch, and I'll talk about that during opportunities. For some of the challenges, I think initially we were working to ask questions, but we didn't have something built out behind the curtain, as Heather was saying. We didn't necessarily have something built out for what's gonna occur given the different answers, and so we we weren't going to create a special services model, so there's no like specialized or specific place to send people. We had to kind of surface for ourselves like where are the, where will the flow chart take people. We knew that we needed training for frontline staff for both workforce and continuum of care agencies. And we didn't really have a good understanding, and we still are working to try to capture and analyze data at different points in the system for whether do we need 2,600 slots or 26,000 slots, and just to have a good understanding of demand. What is the demand across our system, and how many people do have employment goals? We also know that some workforce providers are serving persons experiencing homelessness, and some continuum of care folks are already working with workforce services, and so we're continuing to build out our understanding of like what's our existing state, and then what do we need our future state to be. For opportunities, we have held our very first training so far for continuum of care members on workforce resources, and talked about why work and why people want to work. Also some of the benefits of working from a participant perspective, and then talked a little bit about what makes a successful referral, and some of the other kinds of tools for people to navigate, especially if they're navigating as one of the many, many things they do and not as a dedicated employment team member. So in Chicago, the next rollout of coordinated entry assessment is with youth population. So from 18 to 24-year-old opportunity youth, I know there was one question in the queue about that. In Chicago, we're going to work closely with youth in the next rollout phase of coordinated entry, and so the people that are going to engage with youth to bring them into the coordinated entry and go through the assessment tool are going to be youth services organizations, so specialized groups that do work with youth who are experiencing homelessness. So our vision is to think about a pre-pilot where there would be one phone number that those outreach workers could call. So it's not a centralized program, it's all different youth outreach staff from, who are engaging with people in all different places. So that they could call a number, and then we could understand, we could gather information and make these referrals, and then also understand like what is the demand for each of the kinds of services, and then capture like what kinds of questions and information people need, and what's the level of that demand, so that we can kind of use all that information to inform a pilot level for actually implementing that flow chart that was shown on the last slide. Right now, we are working to build out that pre-pilot opportunity, and then also a pilot for a navigator. And as Heather said, that the navigator would be a person who could connect with a participant on an individual level and help connect them and make sure that referral turns into like a high quality service. So we're interested in working on having a navigator model here, and we would pilot that as a kind of a next opportunity for rollout. So we're probably a bit prior to where Houston was even a year ago when they were actually launching and closing doors, but we have made a number of steps along the way to coordinate having a workforce and a housing intervention at the same time when people enter services. I think for us the most exciting part is for some persons the question was actually happening, a conversation about whether people were interested in services, but not necessarily in every case. So one thing for us is we want to make sure is in our system that at the very least that question is happening, that we're understanding if people have work as a goal, and then that there is, for those people who say yes, that there will be an actionable next step. And I think that's the most exciting next step place for us. And if there are other questions or thoughts or concerns around where we are in Chicago or how we're navigating that, ask questions in the chat and we can revisit. Thanks.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you very much, Nancy. I think a really great snapshot. A lot of communities can sort of draw lessons and maybe apply them to themselves if they're thinking about going down the same path. So thank you. Up next, we have Danielle Winslow, project manager for All Home, which is in Seattle, Washington. Danielle's going to give us a bit of just, talking about the efforts going on in Seattle, talking about some of the specific questions they've started drawing up and putting into their coordinated entry process, and really just giving us some of the lessons learned and things that they've seen thus far. So with that, I will turn over to Danielle.
All right, thanks, Carl. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Danielle. I work with All Home. So All Home is a continuum of care for the King County region, which includes the city of Seattle. So we can go ahead to the next slide. I just wanted to ground people a little bit into an infographic with some data around the Seattle King County area. This is actually from our point-in-time count from 2016. We recently changed the methodology a little bit, so we know that we're not going to get our 2017 point-in-time count data for probably another month or two. But I always find this a little bit helpful to kind of ground us, particularly I think one of the things that I'm really intrigued about, and really as we're trying to integrate these strategies, being really thoughtful about not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, and recognizing that people experiencing homelessness have, maybe they have families, maybe they are of a certain racial or ethnic background, and making sure that our response is adequate for all those different demographics. The biggest thing that I also wanted to highlight from our point-in-time count is that we continue to see an increase in homelessness each year that we do that count. So last year in 2016, we had more than 4,500 people and families that we counted sleeping outside, which was a 19% increase from the year before. Fortunately, we've been seeing those national numbers that homelessness is decreasing, but the reality for us over here on the West Coast, and I know we're not alone, is that we are seeing increases in this. So despite getting more people inside through our homeless response system, we're still seeing people increasingly in need of homeless housing resources and employment resources. So if we can go to the next slide, just reiterating that a little bit more, is that we are seeing average apartment rates in Seattle, and then this really is the broader King County area as well, increasing almost 10% each year, on average $2,000. And again, the reason I bring that up is just that we can't keep up with that with our homeless housing resources alone, and that's one of the big motivating factors of why we are really leveraging homeless employment and looking at employment resources as a means for ending homelessness in our community, or at least helping alleviate some of those tensions. So the other thing I wanted to provide really quickly for just some ground setting is some of the changes that are happening or have happened in this past 6 months to a year around our coordinated entry system. So just like Chicago, we're relatively new in this thing. I know that Houston is a little bit further along as far as really implementing, what is coordinated entry intertwined with employment look like. We have seen some really significant shifts in the way that we have done coordinated entry this past year, including going from a nonprofit agency being the kind of the administrator of our family housing connection, so coordinated entry for families, and then a different organization coordinating for youth and young adults, to where we are now, which is being held at our local government, King County, for coordinated entry for all. So that was a lot of big shifts, and so it kind of slowed down some of the process or progress we were hoping to have by now around also intertwining this homeless employment or employment strategy. But nevertheless, we're at a space now where that is happening, where we have regional access points, so where people are accessing assessments for coordinated entry for all, but then at the same time they're also accessing this exploratory conversation, which sounds very familiar or similar to what Chicago is doing around employment. So some changes there, and one rather significant thing I just want to note too is that we actually just started doing referrals from our coordinated entry for single adults this last February. So just, I guess, a wee month ago now. So we have some things that are still falling in place for this to be a well-oiled machine, but the principles that I'm about to talk to today are being carried out in our regional access points. So one last thing on coordinated entry as far as like how things are set up and just a little bit of where we are situated. In this last 6 months, we had more than 6,000 families, young adults, and single adults complete housing assessments through coordinated entry. So the reason I wanted to bring that up is that it is just such a high number that we don't have nearly the housing resources or shelter resources for that matter to immediately respond in that way. So that again is one of those reasons that we are highly motivated to have this conversation around employment at the front door. And so that's what we've really been trying to do at those regional access points that I had mentioned, having those staff who are doing those assessments also be exploring, opportunities for income growth and development, either with support or outside of the homeless housing system, and having a really transparent conversation that if over, 6,000 people are in need of housing resources, that we need to explore all the options that are available, and jobs could just be one of those. And I think the last bullet I just want to say, I know this is pretty obvious, but we know that people want jobs. People have told us they want jobs, they want better employment, and so this is not something that we're necessarily feeling like we have to force down families and individuals who are experiencing homelessness. This is something that people have already asked for. So next slide, please. And this one I just wanted to also say is there's a lot of people in the Seattle-King County area that are really committed to homeless job seekers and wanting to provide this connection. And this has been something that has happened for over generations now. In fact, our workforce board, called the Workforce Development Council, has partnered with King County and others, some nonprofit organizations in the area, for over 30 years of providing the Homeless Intervention Project. So this has actually been something that has been a key component to some of the strategies in the area for homeless job seekers for some time. And it's just been getting fine-tuned and pulling best practices from those things to kind of get to where we are now of intertwining coordinated entry to employment resources. So, after those homeless employment projects, we also in 2010 had employment navigators, but they were located further along into programming. So once a family or household already got into programming, then they were connected to this idea of an employment navigator to help with their employment-related needs. One of the key findings that came away from that, which is really relevant to today's conversation, is that so many times people had said and reported, if only I had employment or was thinking about employment sooner, my, say, rapid rehousing or transitional housing into a permanent housing solution would have been either fast-tracked or better set up. And so that's really, again, another huge reason why we think we're very excited about having this employment conversation and resource further up the chain when we first connect with people at coordinated entry. So as you can see, we really want to put all of these different entities and stakeholders around the homeless job seeker to see, what is it that we can do. And one of the great things about the Connections Project, it's really helping create that framework of getting everyone together and seeing where those gaps lay or what best practices are happening, how we can strategize the resources and ideas that we have. So now, next slide, diving into the meat of this is really around coordinated entry. So when someone first goes to a regional access point, which is our coordinated entry system, just like what Nancy was saying, around kind of having this open conversation, one of the things that we really framed our philosophy around education and employment conversation was not to have kind of this really comprehensive employment intake, because we knew that the people who were doing the assessments at coordinated entry were not necessarily, nor should they be, the employment experts of that area or, for that person. And also recognizing, too, that they have limited time with people and can't necessarily get into all of those details. So what we tried to do and set up is, you see this as a flow chart, and it's really intended to be very organic in that going with where that person in front of them takes them. So some of the principles was what we've been gleaming out of diversion. So diversion conversations, for those who are unfamiliar, are really trying to be creative, saying what outside of the homeless housing system might be an alternative. And for us, we Oh, sorry, excuse me. And for us, that is also when people are not just at the front door of shelter, but when they've already been experiencing homelessness, because we have so many people who are in need of services. And so really, again, it's really trying to be creative. It's trying to draw on people's social connections or creativity or small amount of financial resource. But what that really helped us do is say, I think this is the same kind of conversation we want to have with employment. And to Kaleem, is that what someone would like to approach, and how can we get there? So if we go to the next slide, you'll see where eventually those conversations and that dialogue takes us is to these different pathways. We created pathway A, B, and C. So essentially, if someone said, no, employment's not for me right now, or I don't want to have this conversation, or I needed a different type of earned income, or sorry, not earned income, but other benefits or unearned income, that's kind of pathway C. But really, the two that we're drawing on today is this pathway A and B. So one of the ideas is that we were anticipating, okay, we're having, hundreds, if not thousands of people coming through coordinated entry every given year. How can we see the people who may have had employment not so long ago, but maybe they just need a little bit of assistance of knowing, oh, something's out there. Let's go ahead and connect them to like pathway A. And then pathway B was, maybe someone might need a little bit more support. Maybe something is kind of getting in the way. There's, something there that would really help them having a navigator. So we have pathway B, and that's kind of, again, this medium or high service requirement. And we use this language and get really stuck in it because, again, we're like, we don't want to have X characteristics equate to pathway A or pathway B, but really more of like, what does that person need? Because we know that so many people are, one, resilient, they work with whatever barrier they may have, and that may not be actually determine what level of service support or need that they have. And I think one thing that is different than what Houston is doing is that we've really left this up to kind of like the, would you opt in kind of thing, rather than having them go directly one of these pathways, which we have seen a little mixed results. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But moving on to the next one there. Next slide is really just a little bit of information. I know this is a lot of words on a piece of paper, but this is kind of where we started off, and this is forever evolving a little bit of what do we mean by pathway A, B, and C. So this could be helpful to you if you're thinking about that yourself. One thing I would like to add or just kind of make note is now that we've been doing this for a number of months, we've seen that our coordinated entry staff, so the people who are having this initial conversation and who are doing assessments, heavily require or lean on pathway B, which I think is just natural, right? Because if you're like, well, I really don't know for sure if this person can do it on their own or not, let's go ahead and make sure that they have that direct connection to a human being and a person, which is our navigators in our system. So I think that that's one of the things that we haven't seen a big distinguish between pathway A and B, regardless of what they're figuring out to be like a service requirement. They were just like, I'd rather be safe than sorry, have someone who knows the system of coordinated entry, who knows these different resources to help them get there. So I think that there, again, there's some benefits to that, and then there is some, kind of sustainability concerns that we have around that too. For right now, that seems to be working fine, but, as, more people are in need of services or, depending on the level of service need that they require, that's something that, that was the whole reason we had these pathways to begin with. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to share a few things of what we've seen so far and a few challenges. So one of the things that we have been seeing is that connecting employment supports, particularly when someone is also exploring diversion, is creating housing opportunities. So I mentioned this diversion, and hopefully most folks on the line have heard of that or are using that in your continuums as well. But we are seeing over 50% of people or households, I should say, who have opted into exploring diversion and alternative housing opportunities have been finding permanent housing outside of the system, which is very, very exciting to us. And a big part of that that people have shared is that connection of getting us a little bit of assistance, having that creative conversation around what else is out there, but also getting tied to that employment support. So that is something that we, are really hopeful about, because then that will just mean fewer people are waiting for a resource from the homeless housing system, and can really open those up for other people who would otherwise not be able to resolve their homeless situation. So there's that. I think the other thing that we wanted to kind of share was that most households in year one navigation or no support at all. So when we've been doing this approach of really saying, is this something you would like to do or engage in, it's really either yes or no. And I'll get to how that's also been a challenge, especially as connecting. But what we've also learned from that too is that, just multiple engagements are needed. So and we've been trying to do that at every point in time in contact with the coordinated entry system, that we're not only exploring, alternative housing options outside of the system, but also, saying again and repeating again, what about employment, or, is there any desire for connection to additional employment support? We've also been identifying coordinated entry and WorkSource training needs. So we have lots of people involved, right? We have the people at coordinated entry and just reminding and having, honing in on those skills. We have the navigators and them really holding a lot of that kind of liaisoning back and forth. And then also the folks that are at our WorkSource, which are our one-stops, and how they're also getting acquainted with coordinated entry for all, and in the jobs climate here in King County as well, seeing many, many more people, just their normal personnel, or their clientele, I should say, experiencing housing instability or homelessness, much more so than just a few years ago. One thing I'd like to mention is that our regional access points were created and selected to be all over King County so that they were geographically accessible. And one of the things that we've also paired is not just the assessments in that way, but also the employment specialists or navigators have been paired geographically. So that way each regional access point, so at coordinated entry, can really work and hone in on what's going to work best for that geographically responsive WorkSource system and also the employment navigators. So that's worked out very well. And specifically, one regional access point I'd just like to highlight, because it is really unique and I think would be our ideal scenario, is that our regional access point for coordinated entry is actually situated and located in what's called the Opportunity Center. And the Opportunity Center includes a DSHS, so for Washington State benefits. It also includes the WorkSource right there, and so employment. So it's essentially a big bank for lots of different services that meet a lot of different needs for the household right there. So they don't even have to go to a different location. So that's been working, really well, and just something that we're kind of striving to do with our other regional access points of how do we tie more services right there and together. So I'll go on to some challenges on the next slide. I think the biggest one is just really, our coordinated entry staff and their capacity, more so on timing. We recognize that we're working with human beings who are in crisis and they want to share their story or, make an appeal of why they need to get themselves or their families into housing. And that makes all the sense in the world. And that can really take time if, especially, getting through a housing assessment as a #1 priority. Frequently the thing to go next, if timing is not available, is the conversation around employment. So that's one of the things that we've struggled with and heard from coordinated entry folks, because it's not, because we didn't make this required piece, because we didn't make it a checklist in a form, it frequently gets sometimes narrowed down to the question of, would you be interested in employment support? And then it kind of left at that, and if they say yes or no, go from there, but not as intentional as we had trained and anticipated. So it's one of the challenges we've been seeing. The other one is this yes, 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 response of, someone thinking, like, if I say no to employment, are you going to think that I am not serious about, my housing or something of that? So I'm going to say yes to everything because I feel like that's what's going to get me what I really need. And we've definitely seen that on the referral end of when they do get connected to those employment navigators, that really we're only seeing about half of referrals connecting and going all the way through. So even if they said yes with a coordinated entry staff, really only half are connecting with the employment navigators, and we're anticipating some of that is just saying yes to all of these things if they think that that will get them closer to housing. And so we've been figuring out different language on how to kind of solidify that and make that really clear that this isn't going to change anything else, but it's just kind of something that could be added. But also, you know, having, again, that transparent conversation, going back to the numbers that we're seeing, needing to access services and saying this might be your solution, you know, that we want to help explore with you. The other thing that continues to come up is just, you know, having a poor experience in the past with maybe a mainstream employment system or program, and just having distrust of that. So really needing to rebuild that. Having been told at one time before, for example, that because they didn't have an address, they couldn't work with them or something of that sort. So really trying to rebuild that trust, and that also comes back with, you know, working closely with our WorkSource partners who have been just fantastic and at the table to really kind of make sure that their staff are equipped with how to respond in those different situations, and to identify any additional training spaces or practice that needs to happen there. And I mentioned this before on what we've seen so far, but again, multiple engagements needed. So at any point in time, one of the things that is exciting that we're seeing now, which we didn't when we last did this presentation in October, is that people are coming, you know, after a couple of months or maybe a couple of weeks after their coordinated entry assessment, reaching back out and saying, hey, you mentioned in my assessment that I could get employment assistance. Can I get employment assistance now, even though it's not in that moment? So that's exciting, because that's what we're trying to highly encourage people to do. I think the last challenge that I'll mention is that we have, I've mentioned and I've spoken specifically around the regional access points as being the hubs, the coordinated entry, which is getting highly advertised and is our main way of getting housing assessments in our community. But we also have community-based assessors. So that might be outreach staff, that might be folks at the hospital, because that's really hard for people who are, you know, in the hospital to get to a regional access point, so they may have the ability to do assessments. I think the difficulty we've been seeing is just that those external outside of RAP assessors are much harder to, one, make sure they have all the information of what's available to them and to make that link to employment navigators. So we haven't seen that happening or being prioritized as long. And so just trying to figure out how do we make sure that if we have community-based assessors, that they're also getting all the information that's available to them and talking about connecting to employment or training opportunities. So finally, on my last slide here, you know, what we're also struggling with, and I was jealous listening to Heather rattle off a couple of numbers and statistics about how their program and their work is going, is just that we, back at April around this time actually last year, changed vendors for our HMIS system, and so there are still some things that are taking priority over evaluation around homeless employment. And so right now we're just having, you know, our data systems between our WorkSource system and HMIS obviously don't speak to one another, and so we're really just trying to evaluate what you know, we think that this is a great idea. We think this is high impact. We hear the narrative, but seeing it in the data and the numbers is something that we still need to set up in order to be able to affirmatively say what kind of impact is this having. The other thing, too, that I think is just going to be an ongoing piece is we really want this to be employment first and not employment ready. You know, people experiencing homelessness are kind of come with all sorts of barriers, but if someone says, yes, I want to explore employment, we are really asking our homeless employment navigators to be the ones to figure out how to make that happen and how to make that work, or how to best support that household. So not saying, oh, well, you have to do X, Y, and Z or go through this before we get you employment. We know that employment could be safety, it could be housing, it could be all of these things, and so we don't want to delay that if that's what's desired by that person sitting across from us. So that's thinking shift. And then finally, I mentioned this at the beginning too. You know, we have, just like many communities across the United States, seen very disproportionate, you know, experiences of homelessness for people of color in our community as well. You know, refugee or immigrant work, you know, people, families and households experiencing homelessness. And we want to really dive in, especially once we have better access to that data piece, about, are we serving everyone in an effective way, and if not, what kinds of changes can be made there? Because recognizing that employment also comes with you know, different experiences for those different population and demographic groups. So those are the things that we're really looking to explore as we move forward, in addition to really honing in this connection at those regional access points with our regional work source systems and navigators. But with that, I'll go ahead and end and turn it back over to Carl, who I know has been gathering some questions.
Yes, fantastic. Yes, thank you very, very much, Danielle. And also thanks to all of our presenters today. I think, you know, as you've all seen, we had some great content. We've had a really solid block of really good information. As it sits, we don't have a ton of time for Q&A. We do realize that. So one of the things we've been doing, please do send in your questions. We've got time for maybe one or two. And what we'll do is we'll make sure to gather all your questions, you know, connect with our panelists again, answer those questions, and send them out to folks afterwards. So rest assured your questions will definitely get answered. It just might be after the webinar and emailed to you. So quickly, right off the bat, we'll jump to one question, and this is for all of our folks here, and it sort of is a stage setting question. But specifically, it's about getting these conversations started locally. So specifically, what political work needed to take place to happen in order to get this income and housing stuff working? So specifically, political attention. What did you guys do in that regard?
This is Heather in Houston. We have been pulling together over the course of the last few years, really building collective alignment around building a coordinated system to include housing, healthcare, and income. So we've been lining it up, both getting everything from getting our mayor on board through a mayor's leadership team to using our COC board strategically. For example, a year ahead of integrating in access to income, we asked the director of our workforce investment board to sit on the COC board and just sit and listen. They weren't part of our world for really ever. So we had them sit there for a year and just kind of learn and understand. And we told him no asks for at least a year. When we knew exactly kind of the plan, a year from that point, we would have big asks. So we strategically kind of teed up the dominoes and prepared to knock them down at the right time.
That's fantastic. So I might just jump to another question here. This is more about rural COCs and balance of state. Do any of the panelists on the call have suggestions for small, rural COCs or balance of states that do not have full continuum services in each community, and how they can coordinate housing and employment services? This is Nancy in Chicago. I had the privilege of presenting to the Michigan Summit to End Homelessness, and this isn't rural, but with a smaller area, regional approach in where they're doing really interesting work is in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and there aren't many providers, and there's not a ton of continuum of services, but they're doing some interesting things like having a housing night where people can come, and then all the providers are there on Thursday evening to touch the workforce system, housing system, etc. And they have a couple other things, and so they even co-locate a workforce person with a housing continuum person at each other's sites. So there's a co-location of staff, and they do other kinds of coordination at a level that I think would be doable for a lot of communities to enter in, and they've had a ton of good results with it. I can give Carl the information on like the people coordinating that, and maybe that could be something we could spell out further. Most definitely. I think we have.
I think also, just to add on to that, Carl, just quickly, is just to remind people that there are over 2,500 American job centers, and there's one assigned to every jurisdiction, including rural jurisdictions, and reaching out to your local workforce board is not terribly complicated, and they do serve rural regions, so I would suggest that there are partners out there to connect with.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think we're approaching the end of our time, but I have one more question I think that is really important. It's sort of been asked a couple of different ways. This is specifically about how to engage the workforce system. So this is a question from Rachel Contos. As we are approaching workforce boards and et cetera, what is the incentive for them to work with a COC? So what are some of the aspects of their program that are benefited by working with a COC, and vice versa maybe?
Well, one thing I think workforce systems are already serving this population are people who are experiencing housing instability, and they aren't necessarily, by not aligning better with the COCs, they're not necessarily doing it in a way that's like benefiting their numbers and their outcomes. And the first thing to realize is there's a certain slice of the pie that has of participants that has a foot in both camps, and so by aligning services, outcomes on both ends will be improved. And I think so that's one driver. And I think for us, we understand that if we are bringing asks to the table, and we have brought asks to the table for like Chicago Quick Workforce Partnership, who's on our task force, has been super supportive, and we've asked for a number of things. For each of those things, we've offered expertise. So we've asked for, someone to come and sit on our employment task force, but for each thing that we're asking, we're trying to offer some benefit back in cooperation.
That's fantastic.
I would also add that if you're not seeing, if you will, cooperation or not being able to connect, it's an indicator perhaps that you need to go further upstream in terms of having conversations just where you get to know each other. That is, do the workforce system members understand the homeless system and who's being served, and vice versa. Lo and behold, in most instances, I know it was the case in Houston, that my people are your people, and that there is more overlap than people recognize, but it's out of this, unfortunately, still some stigma and other attitudinal issues around serving disadvantaged populations that still may prevail. So I suggest that it may be an educative need out there to better understand that, indeed, as Nancy suggests, that the workforce system is serving some of our homeless assistance population, and vice versa.
Yep. That's fantastic. And I will also add that we have, National Initiatives does have a couple of publications coming out around really engaging the workforce system, and specifically some concrete activities of really bringing those folks along and interfacing in a really real way. So I realize we're at the end of our time. I just want to, really quickly, if you could all join me in just thanking our panelists for today. Really fantastic conversations, and I think what it's sort of shown is that this really can't be the end of that conversation. So maybe we'll look at trying to do something similar and getting folks back on the line to really address. We got a ton of questions, and so we're excited to get those out. So that may not be the end there. Really quickly, I'm going to turn over to Tara, who's on our team here, to do a couple of last-minute housekeeping. But from my perspective, I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Carl, and thanks if you're still on the line. As we said, the recording and the slides will be up on our website by the end of the day, and we'll be emailing them to you. And via email, we'll try to answer all the great questions we didn't have a chance to address today. And we have the speaker contact information here in case you want to get in touch with anyone. This will be included in those slides on the website and emailed to you. And you can check out our website for more information about our work and the Connections Project and other things. You can also find our free toolkits there. And yeah, we invite you to keep in touch, subscribe to our e-news, follow us on Twitter or Facebook, and check out our blog if you wanted to hear the latest about what National Initiatives is working on. And finally, our third webinar in our 2017 series is next month, April 26th. It's on integrating trauma-informed care into employment services. So keep your eyes out for more information on that. And thank you again for joining us today.
Take care, everybody. Thanks.